Hello, my wonderful AP World students. So I'm so sorry I'm not there today, but we're still going to have a great lecture on revolutions in living. This is kind of a weird chapter because we go back and forth on a lot of different topics. We're going to be talking about independence movements in India, Latin America, and Africa. We're also going to talk about technology and how that changed people's lives, both for the positive and the negative. And we're also going to be talking about the Great Depression, not just the US, but other countries as well. How, even though the US was very negatively impacted, how other countries were able to avoid the same difficulties the US experienced, as you will. And I'm sure you can imagine that these other countries who avoid those same difficulties do so at the expense of other people. So before we dive in, make sure you've got your guided reading pulled up on the Google Classroom. A friendly reminder that I use GoGuardian. Another reminder is that I have eyes everywhere, so don't think I don't see you working on homework for other classes right now. You know who I'm talking to. So please take this opportunity to put that away. And yes, I still see it out. Put it away. Excellent. Thank you so much. Please make sure your cell phones are away. You're not having headphones in. And that includes those little wireless ones, because I see those too. All right. And we're moving on and diving right into the Great Depression. In the 1920s, the stock market in the US increased dramatically. And during World War I, the US had become the world's leading source of investment capital. And that all came crashing down on October 24th, 1929. The New York Stock Exchange collapsed. And it ruined both investors and the bankers who lent them money. And naturally, that trickled down and it ruined the people's lives who gave their money to the banks. Throughout the world, governments enacted policies that protected their own economies, but it made the global situation a lot worse. In the US, when the collapse occurred, there was a chain reaction. Consumers cut their purchases, companies laid off workers, small farms failed, there was a massive drought. Not that that was a direct correlation, but that happened too. That would be called the Dust Bowl. In 1930, the U.S. tried to protect its industries by passing the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. Other countries followed suit, and world trade eventually declined by 62% between 1929 and 1932. In the U.S., France, and Britain, governments began to take on a larger role in the economy. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, who was in office from 1933 to 1945, implemented his program called a New Deal. You see a lot of public works projects being implemented to try and get people back into the workforce, to try and rebuild the economy. In Britain and France, socialist parties took the lead in the policies in the 1930s. France and Britain were able to escape the worst of the Depression because they forced the countries they had imperialized. They forced colonies they had to purchase their products directly from France and Britain. Japan and Germany also suffered quite a bit. Germany was suffering from the effects of World War II, from having to make war reparations. They were already in a recession before the Great Depression even hit. The unemployment rate in Germany reached twice that of Britain. And in Japan, the heaviest burden fell on farmers and fishermen. In both of these countries, radical politicians devoted their economies to military buildup, hoping that they could expand their empire to a large enough size that they could be completely self-sufficient. India and China were not dependent on foreign trade, and as a result, there was not a lot of impact on them during the Great Depression. However, countries that depended on exports of raw materials were absolutely devastated by this. In Latin America, the Depression led to the establishment of military dictatorships that tried to solve the economic problems by imposing authoritarian control over their economies. Lower food prices hit hardest those areas where the economies were dependent on agriculture. Countries such as Brazil were hit hard. Brazil, the entire national economy was dependent on crop exports. The Great Depression also had a huge impact on social and religious lives. Turkey was attempting to build its industry, and in doing so, attempting to make them less dependent on foreign manufactured goods. Southern Africa boomed during the 1930s. Why? The increasing value of gold and the relatively cheaper copper deposits of northern Rhodesia and the Belgian Congo led to a mining boom that benefited European and South African mine owners. But again, you can imagine this is done at the exploitation of the workers. All right, let's talk about technology for a few minutes, guys. Imagine a world with no cell phones. Oh my God. Imagine a world with no internet. Ah! Well, people did it, guys. In the 1900s, the world's largest cities were all located in Europe. This is the early 1900s. By 1950, 4 of the largest 10 cities were from outside of Europe. And flash forward, guys, by 2000, only 2 of the world's biggest cities would be in Europe. The rise of these massive urban centers in Asia can be traced to inventions like the rickshaw. And the rickshaw transformed transportation. It brought quite significant change with it in terms of the economy. Because, guys, when the cities boom, new economic opportunities, new employment opportunities will also boom. Electricity. Oh, how many of you love having electric heat, hot water, toilets that flush, lights, phones, television, computers, a stove, a washer dryer? Things that make your life a lot easier. Electricity spread very slowly, and it was quite expensive. So, guys, the original purpose of electricity was actually for Morse code, wireless radio transmissions. But eventually, you get things like the light bulb. You also get radio. You get sewing machines, which I know a lot of people don't know how to sew. I get that. But, guys, before, when you had to make your own clothes, like you didn't go to the store and buy a new pair of jeans, you had to make your own clothes. And you had to sew them by hand. So first came a manual sewing machine, which you can see down in the corner. I actually have that at home, by the way. Still works. I also have a very nice electric sewing machine that I plug into the wall, and I control the speed using a pedal with my foot. I don't know how to make my own clothes, but I can fix a hem very nicely and make curtains. Other advances of technology, you'll notice, the first moving pictures, which later would be called movies. So the image you see at the bottom is one of the very first horror films, a silent film called Nosferatu. And it is a vampire film. They don't sparkle in the sun. He doesn't have those emotional moments of internal conflict. He's a vampire who wants to kill everyone. But movies became a thing. And we'll talk about that when I come back into class. So, in terms of how people were living, people began to take on a new identity, and it was less subjective. People began to identify by their nations, and one way they would do that is the use of passports and driver's license. You have a standard way to identify. You also have the introduction of fingerprinting. So we've gone from people identifying as ethnicities or religions or different cultural groups to identifying as belonging to their nation. You also see when you go somewhere, you have to show a photo identification. And that's kind of a standard now. In terms of women's rights, throughout the world, there's a lot of change, especially after World War I and World War II. Most concerning politics. Women gained the right to vote in the US and Britain after the end of World War I. And they also became very prominent in social reform movements such as the Tempest movement. Women will also become very active in the US prohibition movement. In addition to this, you also have revolutions in sciences, both the social science and then physical science. Guys, social science is where you are right now. Everything we do, when we pull a piece of evidence, when we make an argument and we're trying to prove why we're right, that's being a social scientist. When you're looking at why people think what they think and why they do what they do, and why what they do changes if they're alone or in a group, that's being a social scientist. You have psychology, thank you, Sigmund Freud, and sociology, Emil Durkheim, and they're going to introduce the ideas of cultural relativism. People are going to begin questioning and looking at the psyche of individuals. You also see the birth of new art. So artists like Picasso. So you've got Cubism. You have Salvador Dali. And you also have the rise of what's called the Dada movement. And the Dada movement was given that name because it's just ridiculous. And that's why they picked it. So, with the rise of new forms of art, there was a new insistence that art should challenge the traditional ideas of realism and possibly even the idea of reason itself. You also have the discovery of subatomic particles, Einstein's theory of relativity. And what these do is they kind of shake things up a little bit and they get people to question previously believed certainties about nature that had already been shaken up by the idea of Darwinism, or nature's survival of the fittest. New technology was fascinating, but nothing grabbed people's attention more than airplanes. So the Wright brothers introduce us to the first plane, but you also then have very quick updates done, and you have the use of airplanes on the battlefields of World War I. Later on, of course, World War II, but you also have the idea of intercontinental travel. And this is where you're going to see people rising up and taking on different challenges of flying across the ocean, of trying to fly around the world. Charles Lindbergh, Amelia Earhart. In addition to things are changing, health and hygiene also began to improve, guys. It became a part of the modern culture that you would take a shower or a bath every day, every other day. This became the new norm. This had not been the norm ever in most societies. Advances in medicine were phenomenal. Sewage treatment systems. Do y'all like the toilets that flush? Indoor plumbing. The increased use of soap. Washing your hands after you use the bathroom. You also have home appliances that will make life a lot easier. All of these will contribute to the decline in infant mortality, but also the increase in life expectancy and general life improvement. This is also where you see the return of the Olympics. So the first Olympics, the rebirth of the Olympics, 1892. And you really see nations coming together to support organized athletic events. And they view these as a public spectacle. This is where you're also going to see sports teams rising up. So you see football throughout the world, but then you see American football. So, guys, when I'm talking about football around the world, I'm talking about what we here in the US call soccer. The skyscraper transformed the world. This is what men can do with steel. Skyscrapers require load-bearing steel frames, and then elevators made them possible as well. This is how American cities were built. European cities restricted the height of buildings, but European architects led the way in designing very simple, inexpensive, functional buildings in what will be known as the international style. Automobiles also transformed the urban environment, as will the train, because this meant people didn't have to live in the city. They could live in the suburbs. Automobiles would replace horses in city streets, and this will allow people to do what we call commute to work. On farms, gasoline-powered tractors replaced horses in the 1920s. All right, so pause here. Take a break. Ask your neighbor if you missed something. Take about 30 seconds. If anybody missed any questions, ask that now, and then we're going to hit play and move on to the land and people of India. Okay, you've hit play now, so we're moving on. All right, so in India, the population of India increased from 250 million in 1900 to 389 million by 1941. This was despite famine due to drought, which also impacted India's very fertile farmland. Population growth brought about environmental pressure, deforestation, and a decline in the amount of farmland per family. And as you guys know, Indian society is divided into many different classes: uh, peasants, property owners, urban craftsmen, traders, and workers. And the people of India spoke very different languages. English became the common medium of communication among the Western educated middle class due to Britain's imperialism. The majority of Indians practiced Hinduism. Muslims made up 1/4 of the population in India, and they did form a majority in the northwest and in eastern Bengal. Colonial India was ruled by a viceroy, which is a governor, and they administered the Indian civil service. The few thousand members of the Indian civil service manipulated the introduction of technology into India to protect the Indian people from the dangers of industrialization. And this also prevented the development of radical politics and it maximized the benefits to Britain and to themselves. So clearly, when we say to protect the Indian people, I hope you envisioned the air quotes that I was using. At the turn of the century, the majority of Indians had accepted British rule, but there was institutionalized racism and discrimination of Indians by the Europeans. Because of this, the fact that Indians could not take the test for the Indian civil service, this inspired a group of Hindus to establish an organization called the Indian National Congress in 1885. And Muslims who were fearful of Hindu dominance founded the All India Muslim League in 1906. So now India has not one, but two independence movements. The British resisted the idea that India could or even should industrialize. Again, they have concerns about losing their control over India. In 1918 and 19, several incidents contributed to an increase in tensions between the British and the Indian people. And these incidents included very vague promises of self-government and the incident in which a British general ordered his troops to fire into a crowd of 10,000 demonstrators. Indians lost their patience with the gradual British reforms after the Armistice Massacre in 1919. And this is where you have the rise of congressional leaders, most famously Mahatma Gandhi. Mohandas Gandhi, also given the nickname Mahatma, was an English-educated lawyer who practiced in South Africa before returning into India and joining the Indian National Congress during World War I. Gandhi's political ideas focused around nonviolence and the search for truth. Although Gandhi was a Western-educated lawyer, he dressed as an ascetic Hindu holy man. And Indians gave him the title Mahatma, which means great soul. He led a series of mass resistance movements made up of the common man. And his affinity for the poor, the illiterate, and the outcast is what allowed him to transform the cause of pan-Indian nationalism and the idea of Indian independence from an elite movement only for the upper class and then some of the middle class into a mass movement that really brought everyone together. He was a very brilliant political tactician and a master of public relations. And Gandhi launched a campaign of peaceful civil disobedience called the Salt March, which was an 80-mile walk to the sea in order to boil seawater and then have the salt left, as the government had a monopoly on salt. This led to his repeated arrests and prison sentences. Another leader of the Congress was Nehru. Nehru actually ended up being the leader of India. Nehru and Gandhi publicly declared that the Indian National Congress was open to Indians regardless of religious background. And the Muslim League didn't like this because they were two separate movements. In the 1920s, the British slowly began giving Indians control of areas such as education, the economy, and public works. But high tariff barriers were erected behind which Indian entrepreneurs were able to undertake a certain degree of industrialization. And this does help to create a class of wealthy Indian business people who looked to Gandhi's successor, that would be Nehru, for leadership. When World War II began, it really divided the Indian people. Indians contributed heavily to the war effort, but the Indian National Congress opposed the war, and a minority of Indians actually joined the Japanese during World War II. In the 1940s, the Muslim League's leader, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, demanded that the Muslims be given a country of their own to be named Pakistan, When World War II ended, Britain's new Labour Party prepared for independence of India. But mutual animosity between the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League did lead to the partition of India into two separate nations, India and Pakistan. Partition independence were accompanied by violence between Muslims and Hindus, and by massive flows of refugees as Hindus left predominantly Muslim areas and Muslims left predominantly Hindu areas. The Himalayan state of Kashmir has remained a contested site, and even the location of armed conflict between these two nations since their independence. In the same year as Indian independence in 1947 and the partition, that is also the same year that Gandhi would be assassinated. All right, so again, pause, quick review. Any questions? Talk to your neighbor. And we're back. And now we're moving on, and we're going over to talking about the Mexican Revolution and then new reforms that were made. The Mexican Revolution began in 1910, and it ended dictatorship in Mexico and actually established a constitutional republic. A number of groups led by revolutionaries, including Francisco Madero, Pancho Villa, and Emiliano Zapata, participated in the very long and costly conflict, not only economically costly, but in human lives. 2 million people, guys. A constitution was drafted in 1917, and it formalized many of the reforms that were sought by these groups, but periodic violence still persisted into the 1930s. February 1913, President Francisco Madero was taken prisoner and assassinated on the orders of a rebellious general named Victoriano Huerta, who seized control of the government. And Huerta's repressive military dictatorship provoked civil war immediately. A man by the name of Carranza headed a new revolutionary force, and at age 18, this is where you have Cardenas, who will join the revolutionary group. Within a year, Cardenas had risen to the rank of captain, and when revolutionary forces split into opposing factions, he remained loyal to Carranza. And Carranza's army triumphed in 1920. That same year, Cardenas was appointed general, which was the highest possible rank in the Mexican army, and he participated in military campaigns until 1929. In 1928, President Obregon's successor, Plutarco Elias Calles, founded the National Revolutionary Party that would get rid of the constitutionalists. And Calles' successor, you guessed it, was President Lázaro Cárdenas. He removed generals from the government, he redistributed land, he made loans available to peasants, and he replaced church-run schools with government schools. He organized workers and peasant confederations. He replaced the foreign oil companies that had dominated Mexico's petroleum industry. So he is a man for the people, making a number of reforms. So what we're going to see happening is transformations of Argentina and of Brazil. At the end of the 19th century, railroads and refrigerator ships transformed Argentina from an exporter of hides and wool to an exporter of meat. Specifically, we're looking at sheep and cattle. They became one of the world's greatest producers of meat as well as wheat. Their government represented the interests of the oligarchia, a small group of wealthy landowners, and the elite had little interest in anything other than farming. They were content to let foreign companies, mainly the British, build railroads, processing plants, and public utilities, which means the British own these, and the people of Argentina are not benefiting from these. Argentina exported agricultural goods, and they imported almost all of their manufacturing goods. When we're looking at Brazil, the Depression hit Latin America very hard, and this would make quite the turning point in the region. Brazil's elite of coffee and cocoa planters and rubber exporters resembled the oligarchia in Argentina. They used the wealth to support a very lavish lifestyle. And again, you have the British building railroads, harbors, and other infrastructure, and the same thing, Brazil's importing all their manufactured goods. In the 1930s, Brazil resembled European fascism when Getúlio Vargas came to power. Vargas staged a coup and followed out with a policy that increased import duties and promoted national firms and state-owned enterprises. In the process, industrialization brought all of the usual environmental consequences: mines, urbanization, and the conversion of scrubland to pasture and deforestation. Vargas instituted reforms that were beneficial to urban workers, but he didn't do anything to help the landless peasants. And because of that, the benefits of the economic recovery were very unequally distributed. In 1938, Vargas staged a second coup, abolished the constitution, and made Brazil a fascist state. And this not only impacted Brazil, but all of South America with temptations of political violence. He himself was actually overthrown in a military coup in 1954. Vargas followed Mussolini's model of Italy. He organized society into corporations that could be controlled by the state, and he suppressed civil groups. The Depression hurt Argentina almost as badly as it hurt Brazil. The political consequences would be delayed for years. And in 1930, you have the president, democratically elected by the people, overthrown, and you have the institution of a military dictatorship, and once again, the oligarchia are in power. In 1943, Colonel Juan Perón led a coup and established a government that modeled itself on Germany's Nazi regime. As World War II turned against the Nazis, Perón and his wife Eva appealed to the urban workers to create a new base of support. This would allow Perón to win the presidency in 1946 and establish a populist dictatorship. Now, Perón's government sponsored rapid industrialization and spent lavishly on social welfare projects that really depleted a lot of capital that Argentina earned during the war. Perón wasn't able to create a stable government, but part of the reason that he was able to stay in power for so long is because of his wife, Eva. The people loved her. She was given the name Evita. There's actually a musical that is based on her life. And while it's never been proven, a lot of people believe that she was the one who was making a lot of the decisions that would actually impact the government, the economy, and the social reform programs. But unfortunately, she died of cancer in 1952. And her husband was overthrown in a military coup shortly following that. All right, so again, pausing here, reaching out to your neighbor. Do you have any questions? All right, we'll move on. In Africa and Southeast Asia, Western educated leaders began to challenge colonial authority. And that's what we're going to be talking about here. Outside of Algeria, Kenya, and South Africa, few Europeans lived in Africa. The very small number of Europeans who did eliminated the African economy. And they instead developed Africa as an exporter of raw materials that brought benefit to the few Europeans who were living there, but really not to any of the Africans who lived there. Africans were forced to work in European-owned mines and plantations under very harsh conditions for little or no pay. Guys, imperialism provided no benefits to any of the people who are living in Africa. And some of these problems that are going to exist include little health care, and a lot of the colonies worsened public health. They undermined the African family, and they gave rise to large cities in which Africans experienced institutionalized racial discrimination. Authorities always had used indigenous allies to help them administer what we'll call the colonies. But again, we are talking about imperialism. And the gap between aspiration and reality was very vast in the French colonies. Western educated Africans and Asians resented the fact that colonial administrations relied on indigenous authorities to administer their own power. For the European powers, indirect rule was a way of preventing nationalist movements from rising, but this didn't always work. You see a number of movements beginning, especially in Nigeria. And anti-colonial feelings were highest where Europeans had actually settled and stayed. The Great Depression caused widespread economic disruption in Africa and Southeast Asia. During the colonial period, many Africans turned toward Christianity or Islam. Missionaries had introduced Christianity, except in Ethiopia, where it was indigenous, and Islam spread through the influence of African traders. The contrast between the liberal ideas imparted by Western education and the realities of racial discrimination under colonial rule contributed to the rise of nationalist movements. Early nationalist leaders and movements occurred in Senegal, in South Africa, and also from the U.S., where leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois had more influence after World War II. Most of these movements of Pan-African nationalism will not have a major impact until after World War II. And that happens when Africans served in the Allied war effort came back with new and radical ideas. Radio broadcasts in indigenous languages also contributed to the rise of these movements. Not all parts of the world would experience the period between the world wars in the same way. Outside of Europe and North America, there was an embrace of some technology, but also indigenous innovation. We know that urbanization will increase throughout the world in the period 1900 to 1950, and traditional patterns of life did begin to change and to disappear. A cult of the modern will rise in science, technology, and art, and they'll flourish, but there's always going to be undercurrents of despair, especially in the aftermath of World War I. India and Latin America embraced some new ways of living more than did sub-Saharan Africa, where the imperial model still dominated culture, society, politics, and the economy. All right, guys, hopefully you got this wrapped up. If you have any questions, you can always email me, but reach out to each other as well. I'll see you tomorrow. We'll discuss this and any questions you had. Otherwise, guys, have a great night. Cheers, y'all.